Ghost Towns with Mike Roberts and Bill Barlee.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. I'm Mike Roberts with our storyteller, Bill Barlee, who leads us through the Pacific Northwest, British Columbia, and the Yukon. Where to today?
Mike, a strange little place called Eholt.
Where might that be?
Well, Eholt is between Grand Forks and Greenwood. You could drive by it, and you would never know a town was there, unless you were very familiar with the area.
So I remember back to Phoenix, it's copper country.
Yeah, actually, Eholt isn't too far from Phoenix, and it was established in 1893 by a homesteader called Louis Eholt, hence the name Eholt.
Was he a big mover in the community to get his name on the town?
No, he really wasn't. I don't think he ever thought Eholt would catch on. He was going to farm there, but other things transpired in the immediate area.
And that's the subject of today.
Yep.
All right, we're going to cover Eholt today, and undoubtedly it has some twists and turns in it. Copper country in the boundary country of British Columbia. We'll be back in just a moment. Ghost Towns, we're visiting a little corner of the boundary country. It's called Eholt. Take your mind back to Greenwood and Grand Forks. I mean, you can still, when you drive through, you still see the smelter around there and the towers and stuff. This is the country.
Well, yeah, but you wouldn't see anything in Eholt, Mike. You could drive right by Eholt, which is on the main highway. Actually, the old site of the town is split by Highway 3.
It's been paved over.
Essentially, it has, part of it, not all of it. And you could drive right through that. You would never know that there was a town there, a vibrant town, for 2 decades. Well, it's that strange.
Was it a mine town, or obviously railway, a big part of it here?
Well, yeah, that's right. It was a railroad town, and then the Columbia and Western came in, and the CPR bought out Fritz Augustus Heinz and all his operations, and he owned the Columbia and Western. So they came in there and they started running trains from Phoenix to Eholt to Grand Forks. Now the thing is that there was eight blast furnaces in Grand Forks, the Granby smelter, which at one time was the biggest non-ferrous smelter in Canada, in the British Empire, in fact, and they were running these trains, Mike, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And the result was, of course, that Eholt was made a divisional point. And so it was kind of the linchpin on which all these operations were founded. So that the ore came down from Phoenix, down that steep grade into Phoenix, and came into Eholt, and before long people began to realize that if Phoenix lasted, Eholt was going to be here forever. Yeah. So they began to build up in the town, and the town became quite a cosmopolitan little town of about 300 people, but a very steady population. The population did not fluctuate because there were steady payrolls. The CPR always paid its bills. So that, and you had railroad crews, and they came in here, and they serviced the trains, and they changed the crews, and they'd switch trains, and so on. And so this was a very key part of the whole Granby operation.
Only infrastructure necessary to keep the ore moving centered in Eholt.
Yeah, and there were other things that also kind of brightened the picture in Eholt. There were some mines nearby, and some of these mines were really magnificent mines. And this is the old Emma. And the Emma mine was a good mine. It was copper and gold and a little bit of silver. And here it shows, this is the Emma at its height, probably just after the turn of the century. And one of the trains coming right by the mine itself.
Picking up all the ore, heading it off.
Sure. And so you had a number of miners working in the Emma, and they thought the Emma might become another Phoenix or another Nob Hill or an Ironsides, and another mine close by was the BC mine. And this was also quite a proposition. In fact, the interesting thing, Mike, is I had an old uncle, great-uncle actually, Clinton Atwood, who probably owned more land in Grand Forks than any other landowner at one time. And every time he saw land, he had to buy it. That's all. It was just, there was no question about it. He bought it. And he also bought, for a while, the BC mine. But he didn't make any money at it.
So there's not, millions didn't roll into the Barlee or the other parts of the family.
The Atwood and the Stricklands. Well, actually, they kind of funded him. And he lost in the Depression, Mike, somewhere between $80,000 and $100,000 in the Depression years. That's equivalent today to somewhere between $2 and $3 million. so that it did not help the family fortune at all.
But that'll be another story.
Oh, yeah.
That's for another
Oh,
story.
yeah, he was an interesting character. And there were lots of characters here, Mike.
Yeah.
I mean, some of these railroad guys, and a lot of them had nicknames. There was Wild Bill Harriet, who was an engineer who highballed out of
That's all you
Eholt.
needed to be a Wild Bill, was to you say, yeah, and pull on
he
and
just
away
yanked back on the old throttle. I mean, that train was gone. And, and there was Happy McPherson, and there was Harry Shrapnel, and so a lot of strange individuals, and a lot of these railroad men, Mike, I find very fascinating. When you read railroad history, practically all of them had a nickname, and many of them stayed with the same line from the beginning of their career right to the end of their career. And I find it very fascinating because they have a certain atmosphere, a certain mood. There's always something different about a railroad guy.
Well, this guy Shrapnel, he sounds a bit like the munitions man from Britain.
Yeah, it alludes to this particular shot here, Mike, because this is what happened to one of the ore trains coming down from Phoenix, and it simply rolled. I mean, this was a tough track. They were carrying a lot of weight, and one of the engineers was killed, a guy called Leo Macastocker.
Macastocker.
Yeah, and that Macastocker family, by the way, was in Penticton, and still branches of the family are still in Penticton today. So it was dangerous occupation, and it was really fraught with all sorts of peril.
And they did, as you point out, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year.
And the result was, though, you had quite a grandiose little town. You go through this spot now and you won't see anything, but this is where the main street was. And it's rather interesting because the main street had about 5 hotels. And the 5 hotels were well, there's the Northern, and then there was the Eholt, and the Columbia, and the Kaiser, and so on, and half a dozen stores, 300 people, telegraph office, a miners' exchange, and of course this is from the old Canadian Pacific. And these enameled signs are very, very tough to get now, Mike.
And they're really enameled. You look at this, and there's a thickness of paint and stuff on here.
Yeah.
Built to last. Well, you were talking God here, weren't you? The Canadian Pacific was the arbiter of how things went.
The Canadian Pacific essentially controlled the destiny of many towns in the Boundary Country, the West Kootenai, and to a lesser extent, all down the southern interior, in its great battle with the Great Northern, with James J. Hill.
There was a continuing, that friction fueled the successes of everybody else.
Oh, sure it did. And so you see the trains running down from Phoenix, and here's an ore train coming into Eholt, Mike, and you see the tracks and all those ore cars behind the train itself, and this was an everyday occurrence. It happened all the time. It was never ceasing. It never ended.
How many tracks did we see there? It looked like there were 4 or 5 across.
Well, it was a big yard. It was a big yard, and you could look at that today, Mike, and you won't even know that there was a train in the area. There are no rails left. It's all overgrown. We went in there.
If you stuck your shovel down in the ground, though, there, you would come up with the ballast and stuff, wouldn't you? That would be a clue to finding things, or no?
Yeah, well, I stuck my shovel in the ground there a couple of times, Mike, quite a few times. In fact, Cyril Murray and I went over there. This is years ago, probably 15, 20 years ago. We said, okay, we're going to find exactly where the old boardwalks were in this town. So we went into Eholt, and we found the original boardwalk still sitting there. But somebody had moved it. And it was some Americans had come in, and they'd gone over this ground with extremely sensitive metal detectors and had done an excellent job. We screened there for several days, got 1 coin, 1 railroader's badge, which was a nice find, but virtually nothing else. And this was in a very vibrant town, had a lot of people on the main street, and was, and railroaders are not, they don't have an aversion to liquor in most instances.
Should have found a few bottles.
That's right, a few bottles and a few more coins as they stumbled out of the saloons. We didn't.
Does that tell you that the Americans got them all? Is everything gone there of that kind of flotsam and jetsam?
Yeah, essentially it is. There's very little left. But the thing is, what happened, they thought this town was going to last forever, Mike. And this town didn't last forever. Its fortunes kind of hinged on Phoenix. And what happened in Phoenix in 1919 is that the town folded. The great Granby company, which was closely tied in with the CPR, decided to shift their operations from Phoenix to Antioch and Stewart Arm.
Were they running out of copper? Or?
Well, the copper grade wasn't as good here. As they go down on that boundary country, the grade gets less. And so the amount of gold gets less and the amount of silver gets less. And what happened is that Phoenix, a bona fide city, folded up overnight. And when it folded up overnight, it impacted on all these towns, Mike. So that not only Phoenix was affected, and there was only one guy who stayed in Phoenix, was old man William Banbury, and he stayed there for years, and but it also affected Greenwood. So Greenwood was no longer kind of the head of the boundary country. There was a big rivalry between Greenwood and Grand Forks. It affected Grand Forks because the Granby smelter with 8 blast furnaces closed down. Yeah. Hundreds of men were thrown out of work, and Eholt, of course, was most disastrously affected.
Divisional point from where?
Sure, Who cares? Who cares now? There are no ore trains coming through. Eholt is virtually finished. And what happened, that population in Eholt dropped not as fast as Phoenix. It dropped from 300 to about 150 immediately, and then down to about 100, and then slowly drifted away as people went into other areas looking for work. By 1939, 20 years later, only 50 people left in Eholt. And by 1949, there were about, I remember coming through in the 40s, probably about 10 or 15 left, maybe 20 at the outside. And now, of course, there are only a couple of families farming in the area.
And no evidence whatsoever. I mean,
not quite, Mike. There's some dumps there, and one of these dumps that we found a number of different things, some toys, a number of toys,
yeah,
and a number of bottles. And some of the toys were similar to the toys we have on the chest in front of us, and they're kind of interesting. These are lead soldiers, and they're made by a company called Britain's Limited, who made lead soldiers from the 1890s on. When I was a kid, I had about 300 of these, and a lot of these were found in and around. So some little boy in Eholt was collecting lead soldiers and collecting these cast iron toys.
Yeah.
And so we found a number of lead soldiers, a number of cast iron toys right in the town itself, and a number of bottles as well.
This looks like I mean, those kind of finds are the treasure of the dump site, what do you call them, scavenger. He can go through there and find these, but you've only found 1 or 2?
Well, yes. Well, I only found half a dozen, actually, and most of them weren't embossed. This particular one was. And but the thing is, Mike, the interesting part, one of the treasures, one of the intriguing stories of this area itself in Eholt, as well as the treasure story we're going to tell, is that the original dump, which would have a lot of material in it, has never been found.
Well, don't you just look for a ravine outside of town that's easily accessible and is a good place to make your garbage disappear?
Yes, that's true. And usually they were dumped in a ravine, but there are a lot of ravines in the area, and a lot of those, and the old dump is undoubtedly covered over and overgrown by now, so that the guys who have combed that country have not found the original dump. They found a lot of little small dumps, and they've been very productive dumps, but they haven't found the old original town dump of the city of, or the town of Eholt.
And you could expect to find a lead soldier, a bottle or two,
sure,
all sorts of stuff that was garbage at one time that has become heritage material the other. You alluded to something a little more valuable than bottles and soldiers.
Well, Mike, in this country, in an area of about 20 square miles, there are 4 famous lost mine stories, and we're going to touch on one of them today. And the one we're touching on today is about one of the most interesting characters in the boundary country, a guy called Jolly Jack Thornton. And Jolly Jack Thornton was a very fine miner and fascinating character, and some people think that his lost mine has been found. I happen to be one of them. Other people are convinced that it still lies out there somewhere between his old cabin on Boundary Creek and somewhere between Eholt and Skeff Creek and May Creek and 4th of July. So we'll tell that story after.
All of these places, plus Jolly Jack Thornton, who maybe you know Happy, what's his name? Happy McPherson? Happy McPherson. So they were a strange group there. But Jolly Jack Thornton and his treasure right after this break. Don't go away. To attract a man's attention, and this little pan of gold over here will just steal a little bit of that and see if we can balance up these gold scales a little. This is, well, that looks just about right. How much gold do we have in that pan, Bill?
Well, Mike, an ounce and a half troy, which is the measurement you use for gold and platinum and silver.
Yeah.
And in the pan there's an ounce and a half, another about almost 2 ounces in the little pan. So there's a little over a quarter of a troy pound. Troy weight is 12 ounces to the pound. Most people don't realize that.
Is there anything special about this gold beyond the fact that it's just so lovely?
The reason I bought the gold, Mike, is because this is what we call old gold or rusty gold or red gold. And that means it's an oxidized gold, and this relates directly to the story of Jolly Jack Thornton.
So you can tell a region where the gold came from based on its color.
You sure can.
Here's the man of the hour.
And this is one of the most fascinating characters who ever walked through the boundary country. Jolly Jack Thornton mined all over British Columbia, mostly in the southern part, and he settled on Boundary Creek, and he stayed there, and he discovered a lost mine. And I first heard about this lost mine. I heard stories of it when I was a kid in the Grand Forks and Rossland area, and in 1957 or 58, I was down in Boundary Creek, right close to old Jack Thornton's cabin. There was an old prospector down there, Scandinavian, whose name I can't recall now. And I sat down and talked to this guy, and he started telling me the story about Jack Thornton. And I can still see the old boy sitting down there, and he looked up to the hills beyond, and he said, you know something? It was kind of interesting because it was a rusty gold. And he said, you know, old Jack started out from here. This was the base of the story. He started out from his original cabin. He left on his horse, was away, and this is the original cabin. It's still standing, Mike, in bad condition today, but you can look down from the highway and you'll see that old cabin. Most of the roof is gone, and I think it should be preserved. It's one of the oldest, most historic cabins in that whole boundary country.
Is it a pretty good place for us to focus on if we were to sort of backtrack and find Jolly Jack's lost mine?
Well, okay, there's a story behind it, and I'll read you a little bit about it. And this is probably the clue to it. In 1967, a little over 20 years ago, May Jones, one of Jack Thornton's surviving daughters, stated this. She said, my mother told me that my father had really found something very rich. But where he was, he took it to the great beyond with him. Before he got too old, he took his horse Rosie, and that was his favorite horse. It was in the spring of the year. He left home in the morning, and this is the key, Mike, and was back at night. He didn't go too far. Old horse and an old man. And he had a baking powder tin full of nuggets when he came home. He was old, and so was his horse, so he couldn't have gone far. She said he told her that they had struck it rich at last, but he never told the mother where he had found it. Many have looked for it, but none have ever found the place yet. So old Jack thought he was going to live forever. He didn't live forever, of course, and he took the secret of this particular lost mine. So I started researching it, going on what the old miner had told me, assuming how far old Jack Thornton could have traveled. And I assumed that he probably was only on that horse for about probably 3 or 4 hours. He'd have to spend some time mining. And there is an old trail through there which was still extant, and this is through some of that country. And this particular part of it is just beyond, between Norwegian Creek and McCarran Creek. So we went up through the hills here, following the Dewdney Trail. And the Dewdney Trail, of course, was the famous trail of the South. It was the all-red route, went through this country. And the Dewdney Trail cut up past Jack Thornton's cabin, up McCarran Creek, up past the old abandoned town of Phoenix, which wasn't abandoned then. When he was at the turn of the century, it was booming. Cut between Dead Man's Hill and Mount Atwood, and then cut down into a little creek at that time called Taylor Creek. But it had been called China Creek before it. Now it's called Skeff Creek. So it's gone through 3 names, Mike. And as he cut down Taylor Creek, I think he found some abandoned Chinese workings. And I'll tell you why I think he did later on. And I think there he discovered some very, very coarse gold. Because later on, many, many years later, in the 1970s, Big Pete Denartog and I mined this creek and got some very coarse gold, which was described almost to the T, the type of gold that Jack Thornton had found at the turn of the century. And the reason we found that, and I remember doing some research on this, on Skeff Creek, and an old guy called Cal Hopper had worked that creek in the 30s. And Cal Hopper had done extremely well just beyond some Chinese diggings. And when you come up that creek, even today, you can see where the Chinese, all their tailings are all in a row, and the Chinese, of course, were the best miners in the business. So that they were extremely careful. They were methodical miners. But when a Chinese abandoned the creek, there was always a reason. Either the gold ran out, or something, a catastrophe had happened. And I think one of the Chinese was killed, because it's in a narrow draw, and there are boulders sitting up on each side of that draw, and I think one of the Chinese was killed by a boulder or a fall, and what happened is the Chinese would have been gone single file down that creek, and they're gone by sunset. And I think what happened is Jack Thornton came upon these old Chinese workings and decided to look just beyond them, which he did, not realizing the Chinese had left because this was bad law. He then discovered this old mine and came back to tap it every once in a while. So I came back in there in the 1970s, and Pete Den Hartog just before me, and we started mining some of that ground, Mike, and that was very, very rich ground. There were half-ounce and three-quarter-ounce nuggets coming out of that ground. It was really quite spectacular.
So you discovered the lost Jolly Jack mine?
No, actually, Pete Den Hartog discovered it. He went on old Cal Hoppers, but he wasn't sure whose ground it was. So Pete and I talked about it, and I gave him the background of the story.
Mm-hmm.
And Pete still lives in Greenwood. And he agreed that it probably was Jack Thornton's old mine. And I think it is. I think that they're still in that area. You see, Skeff Creek runs into an old little creek called July Creek, which used to be called 4th of July Creek. And then there's a creek just down the way called May Creek. And old Bob Campbell used to work on that creek, who used to live in Grand Forks. In fact, I knew his family. And so that whole area has some placer in it. Now, some people are saying, no, they don't think that Thornton found this there. They think it was somewhere farther up 4th of July Creek or on May Creek. And that is a possibility.
He would have gone, but you feel he would have gone in that direction. So he would have left his cabin. He wouldn't have headed north or west or any place from there. He would have headed toward placer country, and this is the only placer country?
It's the only placer country within an easy ride beyond Boundary Creek. And the Golden Boundary Creek essentially stops at just south of Greenwood, well, about Boundary Falls, the old town of Boundary Falls, which is another ghost of that
I see them placering in there to this day. They placer gold out of that area.
Yeah, they do, but that's south of Norwegian Creek is where they're plastering today, Mike.
I see.
So that is Boundary Creek, but you only go up Boundary Creek, and there the gold stops. So he didn't find it on Boundary Creek. He found it somewhere over in that May Creek, July Creek, Skeff Creek country.
And you were there, perhaps, when it was discovered.
Yeah, we took several pounds of gold out of there. Nice coarse gold, jewelry gold, really quite spectacular stuff.
Do you yell Eureka when it goes off for you, too? I mean, is it...
No, but, Mike, what happens is everybody is affected one way or another. Some people become deathly silent. Some people become extremely excited. But for a given moment, you are not the same person. It puts your head at an angle, it leaves it that way for a specified period of time, varying with the individual.
Puts your head at an angle. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure it does.
I felt that way, you know, when we just got a few colors out of Mission Creek there that time. Just something else. So Eholt, an inauspicious little beginning, turns into a railway town and lives and dies, but what happens around it with Jolly Jack Thornton's mine makes that area just a gourmet treasure story.
Oh, sure, it's a magnet.
I love it. So don't ignore places which may look to you like they once occupied, had rail lines on them or something, because there's going to be a story there somehow, and the story today was Eholt with a little Jolly Jack Thornton's lost mine thrown in for good measure. Where we're going to go next time, I don't know, but join us next time for Gold Trail. Bye-bye.